All right.
We're taking all the best old school wisdom and blending it with the top new school methods to bring you the optimal coaching strategies. This is the 80-20 Baseball Podcast with Coach Bo.
Welcome 80-20 Baseball coaches. Welcome to our weekly get-together here in the 80-20 Baseball community. We have part 2 of the interview with Coach Ryan Brucker, a successful baseball coach in the Southern California area. Coach Ryan is going to answer these 2 questions in part 2. The first question that Ryan is going to share some useful tips with you while answering. What are some common mistakes you see youth baseball coaches make, and what are 1 or 2 tips you'd recommend they try using to adjust and improve? Question number 2 that he's going to answer and share out some gold. He also adds even some bonus information, some bonus tips along the way. So it's just a great part 2 here. Question 2, he's going to answer what is something that you've learned in just the last couple of years that has shown promise that you now routinely use with your team. All right, before we get into that, here's my main tip today that I want to share just from me to you, to the community here. Let's really work hard on overcorrecting, overcoaching. You're going to hear us discuss this in part 2 of the interview today. So I'm going to add to this, I'm going to add a little bonus. Overcorrecting, as we all know in life, is not a great strategy. Correction, learning, growth, adjusting, pivoting, definitely huge. Definitely a huge benefit to those that do it, especially if it's well thought out. We use deductive reasoning, we check our ego, and we move forward and get better. That's just what life is all about, right? Just being a better coach, a better person today than we were at the last practice, than we were yesterday, just trying to get incrementally better. We need to look at ourselves and our coaching strategies, or us as a person, and continually say, hey, where can we get better? How can we get better? How can we correct? But we want to be sure not to overcorrect. Let me give you an example here in baseball. There are, in my opinion, with the shift that you've seen for years now, defenses do on the major league level, and you're seeing it all the way down, trickle down, and shifts have been going on since. This isn't something that the sabermetricians, the MIT graduates that have now taken over the Major League Baseball front offices, when I say MIT, Ivy League, all those, it's not something they brought about. This was something that was well before any of us were alive. They were doing shifts. You can find evidence of literature about this when Ted Williams was playing, and I'm sure it was happening before that. Ted Williams played in the 40s and 50s. You see this shift, you see the defensive shift, and this is just one of many examples of overcorrecting. I think that the teams have overshifted. I think they could get away with not quite as much of a shift because they are shifting based off of, not to get too deep in it, they're shifting based off of the numbers and the data that they're seeing, the spray charts, the data that they've seen collected over the past 6 months, year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe a career for this hitter off this type of particular pitcher, et cetera, et cetera. But also they need to factor in, and this is where the overcorrection might get them, is that the hitters are going to adjust and revert, trying to go the other way. You know, you're seeing hitters already do this. It's this season more than ever. They're starting to now work the other way more. So by not overcorrecting, I'm not against the shift. I was a big fan of shifting my defenses when I first started coaching years ago. I'm a big fan of shifting. What I'm saying is overshifting, overcorrecting, moving the entire defense over. I think we have to be careful of overcorrecting our coaching strategies, overcorrecting how we coach. You'll see today how we talk about overcorrecting with how much we coach up verbally our players. We want to be careful not to overcoach, overcorrect. If we do something with a hitter or a pitcher, if the pitcher you think or we think that pitcher is striding at a distance, their stride distance isn't far enough, do we extend it out 2 feet? Might have been better off extending that stride 10 to 12 inches, 14 inches, or maybe 6 or 7 inches, not 2 feet. So we have to be careful not to overcorrect, just like in life, just like if we're driving down the street. We don't want to overcorrect and then roll the car. That's what we want to be careful of. And that was my message today. And you're going to see this talked about and examples of this given out. And Ryan's going to share some really good information and feedback and some tips on how to do this and how to be careful with this and how to be better. Correcting is good, adjusting, pivoting, just don't overcorrect, over pivot. Because like in basketball, if you over pivot, they're going to call traveling. We don't want to get called for traveling. So to sum it up, as a coach, I think in life too, is to make smaller adjustments and see where that takes us and see if that's enough. There's a great phrase. Tim Ferriss has a podcast that I used to listen to years ago, and I haven't listened to it in a few years, but I listened to it pretty frequently, almost every episode for about 2 years, probably 5 or 6 years ago. At the beginning of Tim Ferriss, which is a well-known, I'm sure some of you or a lot of you know this podcast, at the beginning, his intro has a phrase in the intro that says optimal minimal. And some of you are shaking your head, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so one of the phrases in his introduction to his podcast episodes is optimal minimal. So we want to make sure that we're doing the minimum adjustment to the point where it's optimized. So that minimal adjustment might be a big adjustment, but it might be a small adjustment. So it makes me think of when I'm cooking. I'm a decent cook. I can't cook anything fancy, but I can cook your basics pretty good. I can barbecue pretty decent. Probably not as good as a lot of you out there, but I can get the job done and people are going to enjoy their food. But I'll tell you one thing I did learn in my teenage years and my 20s, I would overcorrect my cooking. So if I undercook something, well then, if that steak is undercooked and I cooked it for 5 minutes aside, well then hell, I gotta do 15 minutes aside. And a lot of you know exactly where that went. So I overcorrected. Instead of saying 5 minutes aside didn't work, maybe I go to 7 minutes aside or 8 minutes aside and go from there. Rather, I just jump from 5 minutes to 15 minutes aside, and that brick of char did not taste great on the palate. So with baseball, we don't want to overcorrect swings and deliveries and things like that if we don't have to. We want to look for that optimal minimal. Sometimes things just need to play themselves out. And also when it comes to physical skills and movements, a smaller adjustment as we go is a better plan. So most of you get where I'm going with that. I'm going to end it there. I want to get into part 2 of our interview. Coach Ryan Brucker, here we go. What are some common mistakes that you see youth baseball coaches make? And maybe what's something you'd recommend them try to do to adjust or improve that?
You know, it's funny when I started thinking about this, it was really when my son started playing. And, you know, my son is a good athlete, but he was never super interested in baseball. He always wanted to play because his friends played. So all along from the time he was, you know, in T-ball all the way through, he played until he was in the 6th grade. And so being a high school coach, that's kind of one of the things that was tough about sort of balancing that parent and high school coaching job was not having the time to really commit to coaching my son and coaching his teams. I always offered to help out, but I had the opportunity to sort of sit back as a parent and watch some of the things that the coaches were doing. I learned some stuff from coaches. Like I was really bad. I coached some like flag football with my son. And for me, it was a really hard adjustment in being sort of a parent coach in flag football because I'm coming from an area where I'm a high school coach. And when I walk up to a group of high schoolers, like the expectation is that practice starts, their focus is on me and we're going to be doing for that practice. And there's no sort of goofing off, right? There's no punching the guy next to you or talking over the coach. And so I learned a lot of humility from the dads who were coaching and who had kids who were older than mine on just patience. And I don't think, to be honest with you, I have a tough time doing that. My patience isn't great with the young guys, with the little guys. So I sort of understood early on that I was better served to be an assistant for my son if I was going to help coach at all. But then when it comes down to some suggestions for maybe, and again, I'm coming from the experience of, you know, kind of a rec little league type coaching situation with my son, not travel ball. Though I've helped out when I was getting my teaching credential. I did help out with some of the with a local travel ball team here, where you know maybe the seriousness of the kids is a little bit higher. The expectation level for the kids is a little bit higher at the youth level on a travel ball or a competitive team. But I think one of the things I noticed in both of those, my experience in both of those areas, the rec and the travel, is there was a little bit too much emphasis on sort of the winning aspect for the age groups. Specifically, I think with my son and in my experience, where the emphasis should be on development and teaching the kids the right way to play in specific situations where you might be able to do something else because of their ability level or the team that you're playing against ability level that's going to allow you to win, but that, you know, maybe isn't necessarily the right way to play the game. So, you know, as an example of that, when my son was in 6th grade, I was helping his team and I was really actually distraught. This was in 2019. And I thought our team was going to be pretty good at the high school level. And we had underachieved. We didn't make the playoffs. We finished 4th. We missed the playoffs by 1 game. And for me as a coach, I was kind of looking at the high school season and I was just disappointed really in myself and the fact that the team didn't perform up to the expectations that I had for that season. But sort of the silver lining in it was that because we were done, I could spend more time with my son and this team who it turned out was pretty good. And so I had been helping them throughout the course of the season and sort of to get back to the emphasis on the winning. We were playing in the championship game of the Tournament of Champions for Little League. We were going throughout the tournament and we were watching and playing and I was just kind of observing and the coach did a really good job, the head coach of that team. And I just sort of sat back on the bench, but I think we were in like a semifinal of the Tournament of Champions and we were getting beat pretty good. good. My son's team was getting beat pretty good, probably by like 5 or 6 runs. And the talent level in the little league wasn't great. There were probably a lot of travel ball teams that we wouldn't have had any business being on the field with travel ball teams of that same age. And so in this specific game, which I think was the semifinal, I noticed like early on in the game, because of our ability level of some of our hitters, like at the bottom of the lineup, the coach would move the infield in. He'd tell all the kids to move the infield in. And so my son is a pretty good athlete, but he tended to hit at the bottom of the lineup. And I told the coach of our team, I said, hey, look, we're down. It was probably like the third inning. We're down 6 runs, but I go, if he continues to move the infield in, we're going to come back in this game, because the nature of little league sports. And so sure enough, we start creeping back in because their pitcher was walking guys. And then we'd put a ball in play past a guy who was 2 steps onto the grass when he should have been back. And my son comes up, I think he was the tying run in the 6th inning, and they moved the infield in. And so I looked at it, I was like, man, if he just hits a hard ground ball to where the shortstop's supposed to be, because my son can run a little bit, like we're going to tie the game. And sure enough, my son hit a ball that if the infield was playing back, and I think it was with 2 outs, the shortstop, because on every little league team, the shortstop is the best player. The shortstop picks it up, and I think there was a runner on first. We were down 2, but he hits the ball by the kid and it goes into the gap. And since my son could run a little bit, he ends up hitting it inside the park home run, and we tie the game. Those are the types of things that, like, when I look at it as a coach, and I'm sure that on the more competitive travel circuits, those things don't happen. But to kind of, with the idea of this podcast is meant for sort of all levels and all coaches who might be listening, like those are kind of the things that I think are important, just sort of in the situations where you might think, hey, if we do this is going to allow our team to win, even though it might not be something that's going to get your team the win. If it's the right way to play or the right situation, like I call that kind of like it's overcoaching.
Yep.
I think not being afraid to lose a game, but knowing that, in your mind, hey, this was the right way this is the infielders were where they were supposed to be, or another example in the championship game of that tournament, we were up by 2 runs and the other team's best hitter came up, and coach came up to me and goes, hey, should we walk this guy? And I go, no, pitch to him. And there were 2 outs in the game. And this was for the whole enchilada for the district. And so I go, you do what you want to do, but if I were you, I would let him hit, right? Because if he hits a home run, we're still up by 1. We have 1 out to get. I go, typically you wouldn't walk this kid to put the tying run on base, because you just never know what can happen, And so as it turned out, we pitched to him and the kid smoked the ball at my son, who dropped the ball. But, and then we got the next guy to, I think, round out to the shortstop. But it was the right play in that situation, to pitch to that kid, showing the kids at a young age, like, hey, this is how you play the game, and this is what you're going to do. And even if it might not work out overall as a win, it's still the right way to play, So I see it a lot too at the youth levels, especially in the rec leagues with like the base running, where you're trying to draw throws to a point where it's like, if you're drawing throws because the other team doesn't play catch so well, eventually that's going to catch up to you, and it's not teaching the kids the right way to play the game, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I was going to say, I think you make a great point there it's kind of a fine line between getting kids, challenging kids, getting kids to see the weaknesses in their game. Sometimes other teams will exploit those in ways that are maybe not a long-term baseball strategies that'll benefit in the long run, or aren't really going to help the kids down the road in terms of skill development, but it does kind of highlight a flaw or weakness. And also sometimes just it's hard to say, well, we don't want to take away the strategy, the strategic thinking, and it's kind of a strategic thinking of this game versus big picture skill and game development. So it's tough. I'm with you. I think maybe it's something the leagues need to look at, just implementing like certain rules that kind of make it look a little more like it will at high school and college and after. But also, sometimes teaching kids to be on their feet, like, hey, this team does this. I know it's kind of bush league, but hey, they do this. How are we going to counter it? Because in life, a lot of the careers and jobs that our kids are going to have that are in youth baseball and youth sports right now aren't even jobs yet. It's not even something that even exists yet. So being able to adjust to something a little different and unique isn't bad. But I'm with you. You're an old school coach like I am, but you're also, and what I love about you and why we connect so well, you're old school, but you're not afraid to adjust and be open-minded to things. So I know you wanted to add something there, right?
Oh yeah. I was just going to say, like another example that would be like, you take like a good youth league hitter, and I remember this kind of when I was coaching in the travel ball arena, and you get your practices, and you get an indoor cage practice and then an outdoor practice practice, and then you play like a tournament on the weekend. And along those lines would be teaching kids that as a hitter, like you want to be able to hit to all field. And so you get into a tournament where a right fielder is playing right behind the second base on maybe a kid, the second baseman on maybe a kid who doesn't have as much power. And that kid takes an outside fastball and smokes it into the 4-hole, but the right fielder throws him out at first. They're dejected by that. And that happens really at the freshman level in high school a lot, where you can't really control where the other team is going to play their right fielder. And maybe you don't have the strength to beat them. And so as a ninth grader, you putting that ball into the 4-hole and getting thrown out at first base is disappointing. But over the long haul, that's going to benefit you as a baseball player, that you can recognize that outside pitch and drive it into the 4-hole. And so that's kind of what I mean by sort of the overcoaching. You wouldn't want to ever tell a kid, hey, look, get on the plate because their right fielder is playing right behind the second baseman, and try to pull that ball up the middle or pull it into the 6-hole, because you want a versatile hitter who can go to all field, especially if it's a player who's showing the ability to do that. And so I think that's part of the interesting part about the game of baseball is just there's a physical adjustment to the field size with a lot of players. And so it's important that you don't lose sight of those sort of fundamental things that you want your players to know, because you want to win this Tuesday game versus that team, or we want to win, this Sunday game and take the tournament ring, kind of keeping that focus. And then I just say the last thing I have on that is the idea that as a coach, it's a really hard thing to do, but I really see that again at the youth levels in particular, the overcoaching, like you don't have to say something between like every pitch.
Yes.
I really see that a lot. One of my buddies was down here last week, I think, from Fresno with his son's travel team, who's a 7th or 8th grader. And so I went and met him, and I was just kind of watching the game with him. And what I noticed was on both sides, between every pitch, the third base coach had some coaching tip for the hitter. It's really easy to get caught up in that as a coach, but your coaching should be done in practice. And obviously there are going to be some like verbal cues and some verbal feel things that throughout the course of the game, you're going to notice you need to reiterate to your players. But, baseball is just a tough enough game. It's tough enough to be on the mound and throwing strikes and hitting. And so you got to kind of give your players the freedom within the game to just make those adjustments and sort of learn and see and feel what's going on with them. And if you're giving them a coaching point after every pitch, one, they tune you out. They're just not going to listen to you anymore, and they're not going to hear the message. And two, I think it frustrates them. That part of the coaching sort of acumen that you develop over the years is an important one. You don't have to say something every pitch. Really in the game, like ideally in a perfect world, I wouldn't say anything to my players in the game. Ideally, I've prepared them enough in practice that they're out there competing and they're doing that on their own. Now, obviously, that's not a realistic thing. And from a coaching standpoint, you need to be aware of positioning and situations. But I think overcorrecting them is something that I would encourage, especially youth level coaches. They're going to grow more if you let them kind of adjust in game and know, hey, it's a game of failure. They are going to fail, and maybe wait till after the game, or maybe even better, the next practice. Hey, look, I noticed in that at bat, you were doing X, Y, and Z. Let's work on that in practice. To me, I think that those are the two sort of things, making sure that when you're coaching to develop the players, obviously, as we discussed, both as individuals, but as baseball players, and then two, allow them to fail, and you don't have to say something to them after every single pitch.
Oh man. I hope everybody goes back and just rewinds the last 15 minutes and listens to Ryan, Coach Brucker, say what he just said. I mean, I'll tell you what, that is such a massively helpful message for all coaches. And at the end of the day, the kids are going to benefit. I look at it like this. I kind of look at it. We need to see more parenting in society and less coaching, like more parenting, more involvement with parents and less coaching out on the sports field. I feel like if parents in our society across the board, and I'm not speaking to all of us, but as a whole, I see a problem. And this is somebody who works in education for a long time. And I deal with what the kids, how they turn out when they're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. I see how they turn out when I find out that there wasn't much parenting going on and love at home. I feel like if we just had more parenting, more love at home, and less coaching on the sports field, we'd be doing pretty good. I call it like I look at it like this, Ryan. This might trip you out a little bit, but I look at like human beings are designed. There's one thing besides oxygen we need more than anything, and that's water, right? So hydration, water. Our body's made up of a lot of water. Obviously, oxygen is number one, but water's number two. But if you go and start consuming half a gallon of water every hour, you're going to get hyperhydration. You're going to end up in the hospital. In fact, I had an ex-girlfriend in college whose mom almost died because she got told she needed more water and water was great and drink drink water and less food, whatever, lose weight. And she ended up in the hospital, almost died because she drank too much water. Now, if water is water is the number one nutrient we need, yet it can kill us if we have too much of it. I kind of like, thing makes me realize that an excess of everything is not good, and less is more with coaching. And this is a huge flaw and a huge problem in youth sports is the overcoaching. And I think it boils down to an anxiety thing. I think it's an anxiety thing and also an ego thing, because if a coach has a player that screws up, that makes an error, they feel like they have to intervene, they have to interject, they have to say something, or it's going to reflect on them as they maybe don't know the correction, or they don't know how to fix it, or they don't know what they're doing. And I'll tell you what, yeah, that's great. But if the ego runs you as a coach, you're never going to be good for your kids. I think it's an anxiety thing, which is a physiological thing, but the ego thing is also that mindset that we got to be careful of. If you have anxiety, you need to go run a couple miles before you go coach, because what you'll do, I swear, I used to, when I would work out before I would coach, I would be much less inclined to speak up on everything. I'd be more relaxed, more content. I'd yell at the umpires less. Now I don't do any of that, but when I was younger, it really made a big difference before I was older and wiser and started getting more gray hairs. It's kind of like I worked inner city, as you know, for 12 years. And it's like, I would hear a gunshot, and my students who they lived in Compton and Watts, that's what they knew. That's all they knew. Not that gunshots were all day, every day, but they would hear them frequently. They wouldn't pay much attention to them. They'd be like, oh, yeah, there's a gunshot, boom, back to whatever. I'd be like, well, let's get behind something, not that the gunshot was across. It would be a ways off, but I would hear it and go, oh, that's not good. And it's like you said, if you coach too much, and I know I'm getting into some different things, but I like to mix it up for the listeners to kind of keep them on their seat a little, but keep it lively. But it's like, as a coach, if we're just correcting everything, if all they hear is this, or it's just too much of anything, is just not a good thing. In fact, I think that's probably one of the biggest adjustments, which is awesome, because literally it's like you're telling coaches, Ryan, to do less. Hey, youth coaches, he's telling you to do less and you'll get better results. That to me is the ultimate tip. One thing you mentioned about hitting the ball the other way and the right fielders playing close, just some of the things that the youth game doesn't, there's some tactics and strategies that benefit youth teams that eventually are that you can't do once the other team or your kid gets physically strong enough to hit the ball over that right fielder's head. You can't play up and make that play at first base on a ground ball. Another one, a big one I've talked about, I'm not going to go too deep on this, but it was the changeup. So the youth baseball, the changeup, I have this theory, my hypothesis is that youth baseball, the changeup isn't as good, is because when you're at a 45-foot mound or a 50-foot mound, the changeup, one, it doesn't have the time to do its thing as much. Kids' hands are smaller. If your hand's smaller, you're not, a fastball and a changeup aren't that much different when you have small hands and a little league hand. So that's a big one. But what happens is they shelve it, or it doesn't have the success, or it only is 3 miles an hour, 2 miles an hour less than their fastball. And so they shelve it and they don't want to do it. And so you're like, I don't want to hit the ball the other way, coach, because that right fielder's there. But as a high school coach and a player who played in the College World Series, a high level of college. And I know you coached at El Toro, who has lots of major leaguers that have, Nolan Arenado. Who's the other guy, the third baseman that replaced him? I swear it's from the same.
Yeah, Matt Chapman.
Matt Chapman. I feel like there was a third one too, but those are two all-stars that came from the same school and about the same time. So you're familiar. You've been around Southern California. You've seen a lot of future major leaguers. So you know that this tactic and the thing that's going on at this age is not going to play out when the kid gets older and if they want to have a career. So I think those are some great points you make.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, the changeups, in my mind, it's one of the most lethal pitches you can throw, at a 60-foot, 6-inch distance. That goes into the point that I was trying to make, just because it's not benefiting your team maybe, or the player, because the speed difference at a young age isn't enough to keep throwing it because eventually that'll be something that pays off for that player. And again, I think so that kind of goes back into that overall mindset that, hey, this is going to benefit this young man down the road, and we're going to continue to encourage him to do that.
Definitely. I made that mistake early on of over coaching during games, of over giving kind of an excess of coaching pointers. And I didn't realize that at the time, but I would coaching pitchers specifically, and I would, frequently kind of give them a pointer. Now, I didn't get too far off in that I didn't give a lot of different pointers, but I did give pointers frequently. And looking back now, that's something that I've definitely gotten better at. And if I am going to give a pointer, and this is something I would like to add this to, if you're working with your third base coach and you're talking to the hitter, if you're giving the exact same tip or pointer consistently. It doesn't change. That might be the one case. So you have like a kid, like for example, you're a 2-strike approach. Like we talk on here as having a less than 2-strike and then a 2-strike approach. If you're telling the kids like, so especially as you're working through it for the first month or two, establishing what we call plan A and then a plan 2 approach. Just if you want to just tell them the plan, something like that. But as long as you're not giving them multiple things, if you want to stick with just one, if you have a kid who just, really is working on something, needs to focus, but even that can get a little rigid if it's a swing thing. If it's a swing or a mechanic thing, that starts to get, and it starts to lead to rigidity. And you take out the athleticism, the fluidness, kids tighten up, they're overthinking. Good athletes don't overthink. They just go with the flow. But I do think there are some things you could, like, I think the hitting approach is not a flow thing. It's more of a pitch they're looking for thing. That might be one, but you make some great points. And speaking of which, I'd love to get going on these next couple of questions because I know we got some good ones here and I want to get into this. What is something that you've learned in the last couple of years that you now routinely use with your team? What's something you just learned recently that you see is paying off?
Well, I think this is a great question because I think I've alluded to before. You're always trying to learn as a coach. And I think good coaches are always looking for just tweaks and things to make their program better. And so for me, in the last couple of years, really the last 2 in particular, is that the importance of kind of recognizing how to deal with failure. The idea that you look at and recognize and take time and practice to recover from that disappointment of not succeeding, because that's a huge thing in baseball. And I don't know, one of the things that I did during the pandemic is just try to refine some of the things and look at some of the things I do in practice. And, a lot of what I do in practice, I try to do and put myself in the perspective of a player. Because, I played from the time I was 6 until I was 22 through college. And if I can share a quick story with you, when after my sophomore year, we were like 20 games into our season in college. And I remember our coach used to post like the leaders for the Western Athletic Conference. And I was off to a really hot start. And so he would post them outside of his office. And I remember walking up with a guy who was a really good player, ended up being a 6th round pick. And like he was number, 3 in the conference in batting. And I was number 4, and I hadn't been up on that list very often in my career. I remember him going, look at that, Bruck, you're hot or whatever. And for me, looking back on that one little exchange, it was like, I wasn't thinking about my performance. I was just going out and playing. And seeing that up there from a mental standpoint, something clicked in me in a bad way. I finished the year. I don't remember exactly what I hit, but from that point to the rest of the year, I didn't hit very well. And I ended up the year probably under 260 or something, if I remember. I don't remember the exact batting average, but for whatever reason, like seeing my name up there and thinking that, oh crap, I have to do this for another, whatever it was, 36 games, that had like a negative impact. It was just weird that success that I had seen up to that point would create this situation where added pressure onto myself. And then I remember so I didn't play very well. And then I went and I played in the North Woods League, which is a collegiate wood bat league. And I do remember my average. I hit 201. And so I went a good chunk of that, that's probably almost 100 games where I was just not hitting very well. And then we came back my junior year, which is the year we went to the World Series that we alluded to. Through the first 10 games, I was hitting like under 200. That was a pretty long stretch from a mental standpoint. And I remember when I got on the plane to go back, I played in Minnesota in this North Woods League. My dad gave me a book called The Mental Game of Baseball. And I read it, in those leagues, Bo, I know you played in I think Alaska and other leagues, you're on the bus a lot. So I spent my summer kind of reading that Mental Game of Baseball book. I read it and I understood what the concepts were, but I didn't know how to I'd still get in the game. If I struck out, I'd be super angry with myself. Or if I missed a pitch, I didn't know how to recover from the failure. And I was reading this book that was supposed to be telling me how to do it, but I wasn't mature enough and I didn't understand how to put that into practice, if that makes sense. And so I think in the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, we've always sort of talked about the mental approach and trusting the process and visualizing yourself succeeding and performing. But in the last couple of years, what we've really tried to do, and we're by no means, we don't have it perfected by any means, but we're trying, is to implement systems, right? What does that mean? What is self-talk and what is recovering from failure? What does that look like? We're trying to emphasize hey, look, you're frustrated in practice because you had, 5 swings off the hack attack and you only put 1 in play solid. So you're frustrated. What can you do to recover right now now and get back in the cage and have a good round. And so I think that's a super important aspect of the game that was probably undercoached. Just the idea that recognizing, hey, I failed and I'm frustrated. All right, what can I do to get back to recover from that? And so that's one thing for me that we're really looking at and trying to find ways to actually practice that. That's always the challenge, is making practice scenarios game-like, but giving the players, hey, what can I do when I'm feeling frustrated and the game's sped up and I'm not performing at the way that I feel like I'm performing? Number one, giving them, hey, this, you can do X, Y, and Z when you feel your body or your mental state going into that arena. And then two, practicing it during practice. So for us, that's one thing that we, in the last couple of years, we're really trying to emphasize and that we're looking to improve on.
This is something that could be absolutely used for the youth game, no doubt. You're giving your players a process, a system, a routine. You're giving them actionable items, actions to do when there's failure, when things aren't going well. So this is interesting you said that, because the last episode, the one that went live yesterday, we talked about, a big part of it was saying one of the biggest values of having a routine is the mental game benefit. And part of that, a big part of that, in my opinion, is that I've not heard this talked about across the baseball community in the mental game. I'm sure it has been. I just haven't. And I listen to a lot of stuff. I read a lot of stuff. And I go, one of the biggest benefits of having a routine is it keeps the mind from going into the negative realm. It keeps the mind from going down that rabbit hole of negative thought. It gives it something to anchor to. And basically like a ship, if you anchor, and so you don't get just taken away by the current and the wind and the tide. And so it's that same kind of having that routine. That sounds like what you're doing. It's funny that you bring that up, because literally yesterday we talked a little bit, but I like how you articulated it. It makes me think, Ryan, it makes me think of my best friend does this all the time with his daughters. He's always like, whenever they start getting distraught or upset or start whining or crying, he's really great at like distracting them, like something else. Like, hey, what about, hey? And so now what's my point to this? He could console them and sit there and ask them to express their feelings and all this. And then you could do that and you could let them pout. We could let them sit on the dugout bench and pout and write it out. Or we could give them something a little more immediate they could go to, something to pivot to. And that way we do it. Kids, the listeners know exactly what I'm talking about. You've all seen this, you've all seen this happen. Whether you do it or somebody, you've seen this where it's like, hey, look, what about this swing over here? Oh, and then all of a sudden they forgot that they fell and scraped their knee. Now they're all about this new swing. It kind of makes me think of that. Like, in not the exact way, but kind of like, hey, you know what? Either you tell them to stop thinking about something, but you don't give them an alternative to go to. I love what you're doing there.
Yeah. And that's sort of the idea. I think there's a lot of literature out there, like talking about the mental game, all the Ken Revisa stuff. And, it's all great stuff. But what I found and what I remember from being a player is when you're in the moment, unless you have opportunities to actually practice that, right? Like, okay, I'm in practice and I'm pissed because X happened. You got to recognize that first, that you're in that state. And then, hey, what can we do? So one of my good friends that I played with in high school, his older sister played softball at UCLA, and her name's Aaliyah Googly. She's in that field. She works with she works with Cal State Fullerton and then youth teams, just on that mental side. And so we've started to bring her in, and she's more versed in that stuff than we are. But for me, just in the last few years, I really think it's something, again, that not only benefits kids and players on the baseball field, but, in the long run, when you're frustrated in life, what are things you can do to sort of calm yourself down and get to the task at hand? And she's really helped us out, and we're trying to continue that. You have to have a maturity level, I think. And I think when I look back on my playing career, maybe I just wasn't mature enough to be able to put those things into practice. But I also know that I don't remember practicing that stuff per se and making a point of it, like it actually being a drill. So it's hard to kind of come up with specific drills to where you put people into these like failure situations, but they're easy enough, I guess, to create in an average practice. It's just a matter of maybe turning the hack attack up another notch or two so that it's a little bit more competitive and a little bit tougher, with the intent of knowing that, hey, look, you're going to go into this drill. You're not going to be successful every time. And that's sort of the point. And to give guys an attitude, or not an attitude, but a roadmap to like, all right, I'm frustrated. What can I do right now to center myself and know that I have to step back in and compete? So I think that's one thing in the last couple of years that we've really tried to emphasize, and that I think has been something that we do in practice pretty frequently.
You mentioned something about raising or increasing the velocity on the hack attack, the pitching machine. For some of you youth coaches that might not be familiar with that, hack attack, it's kind of a way to say a pitching machine, a certain pitching machine that's very common. But we can sit there until the cows come home and tell our kids mental game, teach them, try to get the buy-in by verbally talking, just like anything in life. We can verbally teach, verbally parent, a lot of theory, a lot of talking, a lot of theory. But until they go out and actually experience and work through it, that's the biggest teacher, the best teacher in life, as I think most people would agree upon. I like what you're doing with that. You're increasing the failure with the hack. So I tell this to coaches. I say, hey, you want kids to be better at dealing with failure. We need to increase the amount that they fail early on, because when they're young, they don't realize any different. They're not all emotional and strung out like teenagers get. And then when they get into adulthood, gosh knows, we're not. You want to get them to fail a lot when they're younger. And this to me is one of the biggest problems with the education system is the amount of failure we're allowing kids. We're coddling. Yeah. We're everything is just passing on. Don't give them an F. They adjust the scores, they adjust the tests, they get rid of this. They don't want failure. They've all but eliminated failure in the K-12 system across the board. And then when these kids fail, because life is all about failing, and it's not a bad thing. It's a growing opportunity. It's a growth, as you know, Ryan. I think increasing failure in practice early on, not where you're trying to get them hurt, but it's more of just a failure with the skill and the execution of whatever task they're doing. Increasing failure, making the drill harder than the game, at least part of it, is awesome, because now they just kind of get used to a little failure. And also, if they learn to fail more in the practice, inherently the game is going to become easier. Sure. So they're okay with the failure in practice, knowing when they get to the game, that other pitcher is going to be throwing meatballs compared to the hack attack, where the ground balls coming their way on average are nothing compared to what Coach Brucker's challenging them with in a fungo drill, et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah. And I think too, an important thing, and our hitting coach says this a lot, and I love the saying, is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. The idea that the bigger the situation, the more uncomfortable you could be potentially, right? Or the more you fail, the more uncomfortable you're going to be because you want to succeed. And so recognizing that and practicing overcoming that, I think that's something that, we try to do. And like I said, I think we still have a long way to go in order to find a system that is something we can practice, but we're trying. At the end of the day, it's one of those things that we talk about that can benefit. They're going to be able to take that skill long after just applying it to a batting practice. And I think sort of what you're talking about is within the education system. And I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I have a sophomore in high school, and I think that you hear that the term grit all the time, that we want our kids to have grit and to be competitive and to have resolve. And the only way to do that, in my opinion, is to learn how to deal with things that are uncomfortable for you, like failure, and to overcome them. Again, it's something that you clearly have to have a balance between from a baseball standpoint. If you're just throwing meatballs every practice to your kids, then that's overkill the other way. They're probably not going to get a lot out of that, but you want to balance sort of the failure and being able to deal with it with, hey, drills that also they get a good feel and they feel good about themselves and can work on things and not have sort of the high stress. The more opportunities you can give them in practice, and as you put it, to make practice maybe a little bit harder, a couple ticks harder in whatever you're working on, it allows them to be a lot more comfortable in the games when the games get to be into high stakes situations.
Yeah. If you want to get them good at hitting curveballs, they got to see a lot of curveballs, or they got to see that break in practice. They got to see some spin. Same thing. If you want them to get good at failure, they got to see failure. They got to go through it. It's about quality. It's about reps through that.
All right. That's going to wrap up part 2 of the interview with Coach Brucker. We'll finish it up, part 3, next week, back here every Tuesday. Speaking of next Tuesday, Coach Brucker will answer these questions. What's a coaching strategy that you use that you feel the majority of the coaching community within baseball has yet to fully embrace? And also, what are your thoughts on kids playing multiple sports? What are the pros and cons in your opinion? So he'll answer those next week. And until then, take care of yourselves, take care of your families, your close friends, and take this information, take it out there and put it into action. Use it, test it. You're not going to be perfect right away, but just start using it, molding it into your coaching style. I hope you're enjoying this 80-20 baseball podcast. I try my best to bring useful information, try to bring good resources to you each and every week. And speaking of which, I'll see you here next week. Take care of yourselves until then. Adios.
This has been the 80-20 Baseball Masterclass. Take it to the field.